Let me guess. You think your rent is high because your landlord is greedy. You think the stock market is booming because everyone suddenly got smart. And you think money is just something the government prints. No. You're living inside an invisible machine. A system so complex, so unaccountable, and so radically powerful that it decides who gets rich, who gets crushed, and who stays asleep. And guess what? It's run by unelected economists in fancy suits who speak a secret language called Fed speak. They've convinced you that they're keeping inflation in check while quietly setting the house on fire. So today, we're going to torch the myth of free markets. This is the story of how the US Federal Reserve broke capitalism from the inside, and no one noticed. This is The Lords of Easy Money. The author, Christopher Leonard, is no conspiracy theorist. He's a business journalist who's worked with the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and has done actual investigative work, not just podcast episodes and Reddit threads. In this book, The Lords of Easy Money, How the Federal Reserve Broke the American Economy, Leonard exposes how one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the Federal Reserve, turned the US economy into a casino with no exit doors. He takes us deep into the Fed's secretive meetings, introduces us to insiders like Thomas Honig, the lone dissenter who tried to sound the alarm, and breaks down how zero interest rate policy and quantitative easing didn't just shape Wall Street, they rewrote the rules of society. Disclaimer: this video falls under the Fair Use Act for educational purposes. We're not plagiarizing, we're transforming, adding commentary, connecting dots, and most importantly, calling out your bullshit. So sit back, or better, stand up, because once you understand how the Fed works, you'll never look at your paycheck, your rent, or your future the same way again. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. The collapse blueprint. You ever notice how your paycheck hits your account and it's already gone? You haven't bought a thing, you just exist, and you're broke. But don't worry, the experts say everything is under control. Translation: they're the arsonists screaming fire safety while holding the matches. Because while you're tightening your budget, the Federal Reserve has quietly rewritten the financial rules of the universe. You think you're broke because you don't work hard enough? No, you're broke because your economy is rigged by people with PhDs in inflation denial and a god complex the size of the S&P 500. Let's rewind. In 2010, the Fed did something that would have made economists in the 70s choke on their tweed jackets. They cut interest rates to zero. Not low, zero. Then they kept them there for years. And if that wasn't enough, they printed trillions out of thin air to inject into the financial system. They called it quantitative easing, but let's be real, it was corporate welfare for the rich disguised as stimulus. And guess who warned them? Thomas Honig. A name you don't know but should tattoo on your damn memory. Honig was the only member of the Fed who stood up in those meetings and said, "Oh, this is gonna blow up in our faces." He wasn't some crank on Twitter. He was vice chairman of the Federal Open Market Committee, and every time he voted no, they smiled politely and ignored him like a kid yelling during adult dinner. Why? Because the rest of the Fed had a new religion. Low interest rates, forever. Growth at all costs. Even if it meant flooding the economy with cheap money, inflating asset bubbles, and erasing any resemblance of a free market. You see, the Fed doesn't just manage money anymore, they engineer outcomes. They aren't watching the game, they are controlling the scoreboard. And Leonard walks us into the room where it happens, those Fed meetings, full of acronyms and absurdity, where trillions are decided in whispered tones and PowerPoint slides. You want numbers? Here's one. $4.5 trillion. That's how much the Fed added to its balance sheet in the years after 2008. And no, that money didn't go to rebuild infrastructure, fix student debt, or lift the working class. It went to Wall Street, corporate bonds, and the asset-owning elite. They printed prosperity for the few and told the rest of us to wait. It will trickle down, they said. But let's be honest, trickle down is just financial gaslighting. What trickled was the cost of living rising like a flood and wages staying 6 feet under. Leonard doesn't just throw stones, he shows us the architecture, he names the people, he dissects the ideology of infinite stimulus and exposes the cowardice of silence in the room when Honig said, This isn't sustainable. But hey, why listen to a guy talking about long-term risk when the Dow is surging and everyone's portfolio looks like a rocket ship? Except the rocket was fueled with debt, delusion, and denial. Here's the twisted beauty of it. The Fed didn't break the economy overnight. They did it with math. Slowly, quietly, legally. They designed a system where saving money was penalized, speculation was rewarded, and if you weren't in the market, you were irrelevant. What do you think happens to a society where owning stocks makes you rich, but working a job doesn't even cover rent? You get America in 2025. You get a generation that doesn't believe in the American dream because the Fed sold it to Wall Street for a 0.25% interest rate cut. The deeper message of this story isn't just about monetary policy, it's about accountability, because the people who pulled these levers never paid the price. You did. We all did. In student loans, in unaffordable housing, in the death of entrepreneurship, in the rise of inequality so grotesque it would make Carnegie blush. And the kicker? They're still doing it. Key takeaway: when money is free, freedom is not. The Fed's obsession with fixing the economy through zero rates and endless liquidity didn't save capitalism. It neutered it. And until we stop worshipping these financial high priests as saviors, we'll keep mistaking manipulation for prosperity. Favorite quote: the longer rates stay low, the more you risk creating financial distortions that are very difficult to unwind. Thomas Honig. And guess what? He was right. They stayed low for a decade. The distortions are now permanent features of your economic life. But hey, at least the stock market's up, right? The inflation illusion. You ever try fixing a modern car with a medieval hammer? That's exactly what the Federal Reserve has been doing with inflation. Still swinging tools from the 1970s. Still obsessed with ghosts of gas lines and stagflation like it's playing financial cosplay. Here's the joke: inflation did happen, but not the kind they told you to fear. They had you watching bread and milk prices while asset prices went thermonuclear, real estate, stocks, crypto. Meanwhile, your paycheck was parked in 2008 like nothing happened. Let's unpack the farce. The Fed's inflation paranoia traces back to the 1970s, a decade that broke their collective brain. After years of printing too much money, inflation spun out of control and it nearly destroyed public trust in the system. So what did the Fed do? It went nuclear. Volcker raised interest rates to 20% and plunged the US into a brutal recession just to tame inflation. And it worked, but the scars never healed. Fast forward decades later, and the Fed still wakes up in cold sweats from Volcker flashbacks. They became obsessed with one thing: keeping inflation low, as if it's the only economic problem that ever mattered. Forget wages, forget productivity, forget inequality. As long as inflation stays under 2%, we're good, right? Wrong. Because while they were staring at their dusty CPI charts, the real monster slipped in through the back door: asset inflation. Leonard exposes this in detail. The Fed's easy money policies inflated the value of things rich people own: stocks, houses, private equity stakes, while leaving the rest of the population drowning in stagnant wages and rent hikes. But here's the twisted irony. The Fed didn't just miss this, they helped create it. By driving interest rates to near zero, they made borrowing cheaper than breathing. Wall Street responded the only way it knows how: by leveraging the hell out of everything. The result? A two-speed economy, one for asset holders and one for everyone else. Let's talk about Fed speak. You know that moment when a politician says a lot and means nothing? That's every Fed press conference. They invented a whole dialect of economic theater to hide behind. Forward guidance, balance sheet normalization, transitory inflation. It's all designed to sound smart while saying, we're not really sure what the hell is happening. Leonard unpacks this beautifully. Fed officials, especially former chair Alan Greenspan, became celebrities of ambiguity. Markets would hang on a single syllable of a speech. Did his eyebrow twitch? Buy stocks? Did he blink twice? Short bonds. But here's the ugly truth. Uncertainty is power. The more cryptic the Fed became, the more influence they had. Wall Street learned to decode the babble. building entire industries around predicting Fed moves. Meanwhile, regular people couldn't even follow the conversation, let alone fight back. And the worst part? All this confusion was intentional. If the public actually understood what the Fed was doing, propping up markets at the expense of savers, pensioners, and the working class, there would be riots in the streets. So they built a firewall of jargon and academic elitism to keep you compliant. After all, you can't be mad at a policy you don't even understand. This is why the illusion of inflation is so dangerous. The Fed isn't fighting real inflation anymore. They're shadowboxing with economic ghosts while letting the real damage pile up in the form of inequality, corporate monopolies, and zombie companies living on borrowed money. Leonard's commentary doesn't just diagnose the problem, it names the culprits. The Fed's refusal to reimagine inflation in modern terms has created a financial ecosystem where the biggest winners are those who play the system, not those who work in it. What does this mean for you? It means if you're still waiting for trickle down, you're the punchline. It means every time the Fed cuts rates to stimulate growth, you should hear, "We're making the rich richer again." It means the playbook is broken, but the game continues. Key takeaway, you can't solve modern problems with outdated fears. The Fed is so haunted by inflation of the past that it created a system where prosperity is an illusion and inequality is baked into the operating system. Favorite quote, "The inflation of the 1970s became a cautionary tale so powerful that it reshaped how generations of policymakers would view the economy, even long after the danger had passed." It passed, alright, and in its place came something worse, a Fed afraid of ghosts and a public too confused to fight back. Power without accountability. Let's be brutally honest, if the Fed were a person, you'd either fear them, hate them, or want to punch them square in the face. Maybe all three. Because what we're looking at here isn't just central banking, it's not even sophisticated monetary policy. What we've got is unchecked power wearing a suit and tie, smiling politely while it rewires your economy, redistributes wealth upward, and dares you to question its divine authority. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a power structure so opaque, so self-insulated, that it operates like the Vatican of finance. Except the Pope never printed $1.2 trillion overnight and told you it was for your own good. By the early 2000s, the Federal Reserve had turned into something it was never supposed to be, a policy-making juggernaut untethered from the slow grind of democracy. Congress, paralyzed by partisanship and addicted to debt, effectively abdicated economic control, handing the Fed the keys to the car. And boy, did the Fed gun it like a teenager joyriding in daddy's Porsche. The result? Asset bubbles dressed up as growth and a staggering concentration of wealth at the top. If you're looking for the architects of modern inequality, look no further. The most disturbing part? This wasn't an accident, it wasn't a side effect, it was the plan. The era kicked off with Tom Honig, the Kansas City Fed president and arguably the last honest man in central banking, sniffing out disaster like a bloodhound in a burning mansion. He smelled the rot as early as 2001, warning that the Fed's ultra-low interest rates would overheat the real estate market. He was met with polite nods, academic jargon, and ultimately a shrug. Because the Fed wasn't in the business of preventing crises anymore. It was in the business of managing asset prices like a meth dealer doling out hope. Throughout the 2000s, the Fed, pun absolutely intended, the housing bubble with easy credit, zero oversight, and the monetary equivalent of wishful thinking. Greenspan called it innovation, Bernanke called it containment, Honig called it madness, and then the whole damn thing blew up in 2008. What came next was the financial equivalent of martial law. The Fed, unilaterally and with no democratic mandate, dropped rates to zero and created more new money in 1 year than it had in the previous century. All of this under the pretense of saving the system. But what system? The one where your 401k is worth less while the S&P 500 hits record highs? The one where middle-class wages stagnate while Wall Street celebrates? By 2010, with the economy stabilizing and markets healing, the Fed had a chance to return to normalcy. Instead, it doubled down. Enter quantitative easing, to the sequel no one wanted, but everyone got. Another $600 billion pumped into the system like a financial steroid shot. Once again, Honig dissented. Once again, he was ignored. But make no mistake, his dissent was thunderous, not because it changed policy, it didn't, but because it broke the illusion of consensus. One man inside the cathedral was brave enough to scream that the priests were selling indulgences. He argued that flooding the system with money would distort markets, encourage reckless risk-taking, and make inequality worse. He was right. The financial elite used the Fed's zero-rate promise like an insurance policy, pouring money into speculative bets while regular Americans got crumbs and platitudes. This wasn't monetary policy, it was social engineering disguised as stability. And yet every vote, every rate cut, every trillion-dollar cash dump came wrapped in a bow of Fed speak, so convoluted it made Orwell's Newspeak look like Sesame Street. The Fed intentionally obscured its actions behind euphemisms like forward guidance and policy accommodation, turning meaningful debate into a linguistic scavenger hunt for those not fluent in central bank doublespeak. If this sounds like a democracy problem, that's because it is. Central banks are supposed to be independent, not imperial. But by 2010, the Fed had become what Paul Tucker aptly called an overmighty citizen. A power center without accountability, authority without oversight. The more the Fed did, the less Congress had to. The less Congress did, the more the Fed had to. A feedback loop that turned 12 unelected economists into the most powerful economic actors on the planet. And that's the real scandal here. Not that the Fed acted during the crisis, but that it never stopped acting. It became the market. It became the stimulus. It became the referee, the coach, and the owner of the team, and somehow we just let it happen. Key takeaway: unaccountable power isn't just dangerous, it's corrosive. The Federal Reserve's transformation into an omnipotent economic actor has quietly undermined democratic governance, distorted markets, and deepened inequality. And most terrifyingly, we've normalized it. Favorite quote: "When this happens, central banks become overmighty citizens, capable of imposing sweeping changes on national life without the democratic accountability of democratic institutions." The ZERP trap.